In most crimes, there is a clear motive that helps investigators determine the perpetrator's identity and the circumstances surrounding the offense. However, sometimes people's actions are so incomprehensible and devoid of logic that they remain a mystery even after a thorough investigation. It's especially chilling to realize that innocent lives are lost due to such unfathomable acts. In our time, new technologies are rapidly developing and impacting all spheres of life. This process has not bypassed forensic science. Modern methods and tools allow for more effective crime investigation and also open up the possibility of solving old cases that once shocked entire cities with their brutality. Today, we'll discuss one such case. Norma Garcia was born on November 16, 1960, in the small town of Mercedes, located in the southern part of Texas, USA, near the border with Mexico. At that time, the population of Mercedes was about 15,000 people. As in many other small settlements in the American heartland, most residents of Mercedes, about 75%, were engaged in agriculture. There was an atmosphere of cohesion and mutual support. Everyone knew each other. The racial composition of the town's population was quite homogeneous. Approximately 90% were Hispanic, for whom Spanish was their first or second language. Norma Garcia's family also belonged to the Spanish-speaking community. Norma was one of 7 children in the family, having 6 brothers and sisters with whom she always maintained close and warm relationships. The girl was distinguished by her calm disposition and reticence, avoiding any trouble and always behaving more quietly than other children. When Norma turned 12, her parents decided to move to the state of California in search of a better life. They settled in Oxnard, a fairly large city with a population of 200,000. The entire family had high hopes for the move, believing that life in California would allow them to improve their financial situation. This step was especially important for the children, as it opened up new opportunities for them compared to quiet and sparsely populated Texas. Of course, life in Oxnard was very different from the measured existence in Mercedes. However, Norma quickly adapted to the new conditions and especially fell in love with the local beaches with their incredible sunsets. The girl could spend hours admiring these landscapes. In 1980, Norma graduated from high school and decided to continue her education at a local college, not wanting to part with her family for long. During her sophomore year, the girl met Anthony Rodriguez, who became her first serious love. The young couple dated for almost 2 years, and then, on March 6, 1982, they got married. Both were 21 years old at the time. This marriage was Norma's first step towards the family life she had always dreamed of. That same year, the couple had their firstborn, a son they named Andrew. And in 1989, the family was joined by another boy, Austin. Now Norma felt that she had the perfect family she had always wanted. As a loving mother, the woman strove to give her children the best of everything, especially a good education, so that they could find a worthy place in life. Therefore, in addition to raising her sons, Norma began to work actively, getting a job as an assistant manager at a local supermarket. However, despite all of Norma's efforts, the relationship with her husband began to deteriorate. In 1991, Anthony began to travel more often on business to other cities, rarely being at home. All household chores fell on Norma's shoulders. The woman had to take care of the children, household, and continue working. The relationship in the family became increasingly strained, with Norma and Anthony arguing more and more often. Norma often complained to her closest friend, Teresa, that Anthony had started abusing alcohol. The man became aggressive and could even raise his hand against his wife and older son. Despite her reluctance to become a single mother, Norma increasingly leaned towards the idea that living together with Anthony was becoming too dangerous for her and the children. After another incident, the woman decided to take a decisive step. She took her sons and moved into a duplex located a 10-minute drive from the house where they lived with Anthony. Norma filed for divorce but continued to maintain a relationship with her ex-husband for the sake of the children. Her new home was located in the neighboring town of Port Hueneme, which had a population of about 20,000, most of whom were local farm workers. Nearby was a wonderful park located not far from the coast. Norma loved walking there with her children every evening when she had free time. New neighbors considered Norma to be a friendly, albeit somewhat withdrawn person. The woman kept to herself, completely devoting herself to taking care of her children. She did not miss a single school event involving Andrew and tried to spend all her free time with her sons. Despite her devotion to her family, this period of life turned out to be quite difficult for Norma. She had to work a lot, often overtime, to provide for her children's future on her own. The woman was very tired, her only joy and incentive to live were her sons. Norma believed that everything would be fine and could not even imagine what a tragic turn her fate would soon take. In the spring of 1993, when Norma turned 32, she met Daniel, a mechanic by profession who also coached a children's baseball team. Norma's older son, 11-year-old Andrew, also played on that team. Norma and Daniel met at a party of mutual acquaintances. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them. The new couple spent a lot of time together, often walking in the park that Norma loved so much. The man quickly found common ground with her sons. All of Norma's friends and relatives noted that the relationship with Daniel had a very positive effect on the woman. Next to him, she finally felt truly happy for the first time after a painful divorce from Anthony. But despite the apparent idyll, in the middle of the same year, Daniel suddenly told Norma that he wanted to end their relationship. For the woman, this came as a complete surprise. She took her beloved's decision very hard. Daniel explained that he had decided to rekindle his relationship with his ex-girlfriend, with whom he had recently started communicating again. The breakup with Daniel was a serious emotional shock for Norma, but the woman found the strength not to sink into depression. To distract herself from heavy thoughts and cheer up a little, she decided to arrange a barbecue party at home on Saturday, May 29, 1993. Norma invited her relatives and friends to this event, including her sisters and her best friend Beatrice. The party was a great success, the guests had a good time. And the next day, on Sunday, May 30th, Norma decided to devote herself to relaxation. She spent most of the day at home with her younger 4-year-old son Austin, mostly watching TV. The heroine's older son, Andrew, was visiting his father Anthony in Oxnard that weekend, who was supposed to bring the boy home on Monday. On the evening of May 30th, Beatrice called Norma and suggested that her friend go to the beach together the next day. Since Norma had no specific plans, she agreed. It seemed to the woman that a short walk would help to finally get rid of the sadness over the breakup with her beloved. That Sunday evening was no different from many others, nothing foreshadowed trouble. But the very next morning, June 1st, at 7:47, the silence of Port Hueneme was broken by an alarming call to the 911 rescue service. Norma's ex-husband, 33-year-old Anthony Rodriguez, reported in an extremely agitated voice that he had found the woman dead in her own home. Law enforcement officers instantly reacted to this message, because murder cases in their small town were extremely rare. In the last 3 years, there had not been a single crime of this kind in Port Hueneme. When the investigators arrived at the scene, Anthony Rodriguez and his cousin Hector were already waiting for them near the house. Norma's 2 sons, frightened and confused, stood in the driveway. And inside the house, a terrifying sight awaited the detectives. On the living room floor lay the body of 32-year-old Norma. There were no visible bleeding or wounds on it. Instead, the victim's head was tightly wrapped in a thick layer of silver duct tape. There was so much tape that it later took experts quite a long time to cut it off to get to the face of the deceased. Now it resembled a horrible mummy mask. Upon closer examination, it became apparent that someone had tried to tear off pieces of tape in the area of Norma's mouth and nose but was forced to abandon this endeavor. The medical examiner who arrived at the crime scene quickly determined that Norma had been dead for over 24 hours. This was evidenced by clear signs of rigor mortis. Another detail that immediately attracted the expert's attention was that the victim's shorts were unbuttoned. This suggested a possible but an autopsy was necessary for a final conclusion. Examining the body of the deceased, the investigators came to a preliminary conclusion: Norma probably knew her killer well. This was indicated by one telling detail: the opaque tape that completely hid the victim's face. It was quite possible that in this way, the perpetrator was trying to avoid recognition. However, despite a scrupulous examination of the crime scene, the detectives were unable to find any direct evidence of a struggle or forced entry into the house. No blood traces or damage to the furnishings were found. The only thing that stood out from the overall picture was a bunch of house keys carelessly thrown on the floor next to Norma's body. Items of material value remained in the house untouched. It seemed that the killer did not even pay attention to them. Recalling that day, the employees of the Port Hueneme Police Department say that they mobilized all possible resources to investigate this brazen crime. The police force in the town was small, only 20 people, so forensic experts from neighboring settlements had to be involved. However, despite a thorough study of the crime scene, they were unable to find even a single clue. Later that same day, Norma's sister Aurelia came to her home. The women had agreed to go shopping together in the morning, but Aurelia could not reach Norma all day. Alarmed by the prolonged silence, the sister decided to visit Norma's house and check if everything was all right. The yellow barrier tapes that had already been thrown around the crime scene were a terrible shock for Aurelia. The victim's sister willingly shared with the police everything she knew. According to Aurelia, Norma had a strained relationship with her ex-husband, but the woman had no other ill-wishers. This information immediately attracted the close attention of the detectives. After all, it was Anthony Rodriguez who first called the rescue service and reported the death of his ex-wife. Moreover, as far as the investigation knew, he was the last person to see Norma alive, not counting her young children. The police took all the adults who were at the crime scene to the station to interrogate each of them. During a conversation with detectives, Anthony behaved like a person who sincerely mourns the loss of a loved one, although at the time of the tragedy, he and Norma had not been living together for a long time. It seemed that the man still loved her. Rodriguez assured that he had no idea who could have harmed his defenseless ex-wife. According to Anthony, on June 1st, around 7:30 in the morning, he arrived at Norma's house, as they had agreed the day before. The purpose of the visit was simple: to take the sons to school and kindergarten. This is how the ex-spouse's usual routine looked, which they continued to adhere to after the divorce for the sake of the children. This time Anthony did not come alone, but with his cousin Hector. While the father went up to the house to pick up his sons, Hector waited in the parked pickup truck. Anthony knocked on the door, but no one answered. As he later told the police, an oppressive silence reigned inside the house. No one responded to his calls. Seized by a bad premonition, Rodriguez tried to open the door, but it turned out that he did not have his own key, and Norma, for some reason, did not open it. Then the man used his bank card as an improvised lock pick, sliding it between the doorframe and the door. In this way, he managed to move the lock and get into the house. There, a terrible sight awaited Anthony. In the room on the floor, he saw the body of his ex-wife. Rushing to Norma, Rodriguez noticed that her head was wrapped in duct tape, and the top of her shorts was unbuttoned. Seeing the eerie picture, Anthony, embarrassed and frightened, rushed out of the house and called to his cousin Hector, who remained in the car. Hector hurried to the house, followed by Norma's children, awakened by the noise and shouts. The boys found themselves in the living room and saw their mother's lifeless body with their own eyes. The uncle immediately sent the shocked children to their rooms, and he himself rushed to Norma. Touching her body, Hector thought he felt warmth. He instantly grabbed scissors and a lighter from the truck and returned to the house, hoping it was not too late to save Norma. The man tried to cut the duct tape in the area of the nose and mouth so that the woman could breathe. But when he finally managed to free her face, it became clear: Norma was not breathing, there was no pulse. She was already dead. These testimonies raised some doubts among the detectives. According to the preliminary conclusions of the medical examiner, Norma's death occurred more than a day ago, and the body had already had time to stiffen. So the statement about feeling warmth seemed strange. However, Hector explained this by a state of shock and fright. Although the brothers' behavior could be considered a completely natural reaction to the horrific discovery, by their actions they unintentionally destroyed a lot of potential evidence. Their fingerprints, shoe particles, and even DNA samples got on the body in duct tape. This could seriously complicate the further collection of physical evidence. Law enforcement officers quickly found out that Anthony could have a motive for killing his ex-wife. He took their divorce hard and was extremely jealous of Norma's new relationships, especially her romance with Daniel. Apart from jealousy, the couple could have had disputes over custody of the children and the payment of alimony, since the boys remained living with their mother. Anthony admitted that although he and Norma had separated several years ago, they had not officially divorced yet. The former spouses tried to maintain a normal relationship for the sake of their sons in order to set a good example for them. From Anthony's own words, everything looked quite decent, but the victim's relatives told the detectives more alarming details. Norma's loved one said that recently the woman had been complaining about her ex-husband's excessive intrusiveness, about his constant attempts to control her every step. Anthony explained this by his natural desire to see his children more often. However, a different view was formed in Norma's family. They believed that in fact, Anthony deliberately created reasons for visits, cherishing the hope of restoring the marriage. According to their testimonies, the man had more than once suggested to Norma to go somewhere together, to spend time alone. But such proposals only irritated the woman and often became a reason for quarrels between the former spouses. In light of these circumstances, the investigators decided to check Anthony and his brother Hector more thoroughly. The men were asked to take a polygraph test, and they agreed without hesitation. To the surprise of the detectives, both successfully coped with the task. Although at first the suspicions about the brothers' involvement in the murder seemed quite reasonable, it had to be admitted that the polygraph test did not provide grounds to consider them guilty. Anthony and Hector were released, but they were not finally crossed off the list of potential suspects. The investigation continued. Now the detectives focused on other people from the victim's immediate circle of communication. After the autopsy, the forensic experts concluded that the woman had not been assaulted before her death, although her clothing was unbuttoned. It is quite possible that the killer deliberately left Norma's shorts unbuttoned in order to confuse the investigation and send it down the wrong path. The experts were most struck by the condition of the victim's head. The duct tape was wrapped around it 14 times. Almost the entire roll of tape was used to mummify Norma's face. Upon careful examination of the oral cavity, the forensic experts found cuts on the woman's tongue. Obviously, she accidentally bit it when the killer was tightening the tape. Despite the terrible mockery with the tape, it was strangulation with bare hands that became the direct cause of Norma's death. Her head was wrapped after she died. This was the conclusion reached by the medical examiner. It remained a mystery why the criminal needed to use duct tape at all, and in such a large amount. So far, the investigators did not find a logical explanation for this act. The experts managed to establish a more precise time frame for the commission of the crime. Most likely, Norma was killed between 10:30 p.m. on Sunday, May 30th, and 5 a.m. on Monday, May 31st. That is, it turned out that 4-year-old Austin was in the house with his mother's body for at least a day. The boy did not suspect anything all this time and, as usual, ran around his mother. It is quite possible that the child became the only witness who saw the killer with his own eyes. Criminologists carefully collected all the biological material that could have been left under the victim's nails during the struggle with the attacker. Traces of the criminal could also have been preserved on the duct tape. However, the level of technology development in the early 90s did not allow for a full-fledged DNA examination of these samples. All the seized physical evidence was placed in a special storage facility to preserve it for future research. Unfortunately, at that time, they could not provide any clue to solve the case. And yet, the detectives made several important conclusions about the identity of the killer. The investigators had almost no doubt that the criminal was well acquainted with Norma. And having carefully wrapped her head with tape, he most likely tried to distance himself from what he had done, to stifle the inner voice that reproached him for this eerie act. To move forward with the investigation, the police decided to question the victim's children. Norma's older son, Andrew, said that late in the evening of May 31st, his father brought him home. The boy knocked on the door, but his mother did not open it. Then Andrew noticed an ajar window. The gap was just enough to crawl inside. Once inside the house, he was surprised why his younger brother was still awake, even though it was already completely dark outside. When asked by Andrew, the boy explained that his mother was not feeling well, something was wrong with her head, so he was waiting for her to recover. The older son did not quite understand what Austin meant. Andrew assumed that his tired mother had just gone to take a nap in the living room, as she often did. So he decided not to disturb Norma, but simply put his younger brother to bed and went to his own room. Usually, children as young as Austin cannot provide too much useful information. But this time, the boy surprised the detectives with quite detailed testimony. Of course, the child was questioned in the presence of a child psychologist so as not to cause him even more trauma. According to Austin, on the evening of May 31st, his mother opened the door to a dark-skinned man named Corey. An intense argument almost immediately broke out between Norma and the stranger. And then, before the eyes of the frightened boy, Corey brutally attacked his mother and forcibly wrapped her head with duct tape. After finishing the violence, the man fled with all his might. Austin did not lose his head and ran after him in pursuit. The little boy bravely chased his mother's offender up to the street, running several dozen meters away from the house. But Corey had long legs, so the boy quickly realized that it was beyond his power to catch up with the adult criminal. Then Austin returned to the house and locked the front door behind him. Despite the fact that Austin's version sounded not entirely convincing, especially regarding the pursuit of the criminal, 10 days later the boy provided new testimony. This time he claimed that a light-skinned man named Orn entered the house through the kitchen door and wrapped his mother's head with tape. This information surprised the police, because nothing indicated that more than one person had attacked the woman. In addition, the child radically changed his previous story. Eventually, the detectives attributed these changes to excessive attention from Norma's relatives, who often communicated with Austin after the murder, which could affect his memories. Despite these discrepancies, the investigators quickly established that there were two men in the victim's immediate circle, Corey and Orn, whom Norma's relatives mentioned. It turned out that the deceased had worked with them and had friendly relations for a long time. Orn McKee was even present at a party organized by the victim and lived about a 20-minute drive from her home. They often met and communicated, and it was known that the man had feelings for Norma. He had invited her on a date several times but was refused, after which he became even more persistent and often came to her home uninvited. The woman herself admitted that she did not have romantic feelings for him but did not want to rudely push him away so as not to offend him. Most witnesses described Orn as a calm and pleasant person, although some considered him a bit eccentric. During interrogation, the man confirmed that he was at Norma's party. They talked until all the guests left, and then went to her house, where they watched TV for some time before he left around 10:30. The next day, according to him, he went to meet with friends in Santa Barbara. Orn denied his involvement in the murder and insisted that his relationship with Norma was exclusively friendly, without any romantic intentions on his part. Subsequently, the suspect's friends confirmed his alibi. Another man, Corey Davis, who worked with Norma, unlike Orn, who was her former colleague, claimed that they were just work acquaintances and communicated as friends. He reported that on the night of the murder, he was at home with his parents. During interrogation, the detectives noticed that Corey was behaving nervously and reluctantly cooperating, but apart from this, they did not find any alarming signals. Continuing communication with Norma's loved ones, the investigators unexpectedly learned from her friend Beatrice that at the barbecue before her death, the woman complained about losing the keys to the house. Interestingly, These keys were found next to the body of the deceased when the police first arrived at the call. It seemed that this information could become a breakthrough in the case. The detectives decided to talk to Corey again, who aroused their suspicions, and went to the address he provided them. However, it turned out that the man had lied and actually lived in another place. This increased the suspicion of the dark-skinned suspect. The investigators decided that both Corey and Orn should take a polygraph test. To the surprise of the detectives, both men easily coped with the test. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. There was one more interesting character on the list of suspects, Norma's ex-boyfriend named Daniel. Orn said that shortly before the breakup, the couple had problems in their relationship, which he learned about from the victim herself. One day, Daniel even came to Norma's work and made a scene. Therefore, the police decided to interrogate him at the station. During a conversation with detectives, Daniel denied any problems in his relationship with his ex-girlfriend. He claimed that they had broken up a long time ago but remained friends. Now the man was dating another woman and claimed that he was no longer interested in Norma. He also denied the conflict at her work. Daniel's alibi was confirmed, and he managed to successfully pass the polygraph test. It seemed that the investigation had run out of leads. The only thing left for the police was to return to the very beginning of the investigation. They talked to Beatrice, the victim's friend, again. The woman admitted that her friendship with Norma was so close that she even told her about her secret affair on the side, which her husband did not know about. Norma allowed Beatrice to use her home for meetings with her lover and even gave her keys for free access. This information led the detectives to think that Beatrice's husband could have taken revenge on Norma for facilitating his wife's infidelity. Or the murder could have been the work of the friend's lover himself. Now the police had two new suspects at once, who should be thoroughly checked. First, the investigators talked to Beatrice's husband, but his alibi was confirmed. Then they met with the woman's lover, but they quickly crossed him off the list of suspects. The situation changed dramatically 26 days after Norma's murder, when the police found another body. This time, the victim was an 87-year-old deaf-mute woman named Beatrice Phyllis, who had nothing to do with the friend of the first deceased. She was found stabbed to death in her own bed in a room on the third floor of a nursing home located a few blocks from Norma's duplex. The shocking events continued a month later, on August 5, when 44-year-old Cynthia Berger, who worked as a customer service manager at one of the local companies, was found dead in her own home. Initially, firefighters were called to the scene due to a fire, but upon arrival, they found the woman's body in the bathroom. The investigation established that the victim had been strangled, but the direct cause of death was smoke inhalation, since she was still alive after the abuse. These events were a real shock for the police department of the small town, where there was practically no crime before. Now the detectives had 3 murder cases on their hands, which suggested a serial killer who needed to be stopped as soon as possible. The investigators could barely cope with such a load, even the sheriff had to do the work of a detective. At the same time, public pressure was growing, local residents organized memorial rallies, trying to draw attention to these tragedies. Given that the department was not ready to investigate such a number of serious crimes, an FBI agent who specialized in compiling psychological portraits of criminals was involved in the case. An analysis of the killer's behavior showed that he was probably very close to Norma. The agent believed that the criminal wrapped the victim's head with tape before strangulation, not after, in order to depersonalize her and suppress his own feelings that could prevent him from carrying out his plan. Almost a year and a half later, in November 1995, information appeared about a man who was suspected of murdering at least 5 women in the United States. He turned out to be 33-year-old Glenn Edward Rogers, whose modus operandi resembled the cases that occurred in the city. Glenn, known as the killer, was found guilty of first-degree murder of 2 women, the first in Florida in 1997, and the second in California in June 1999. After his arrest, he initially confessed to the police to committing about 70 murders and claimed that at the time of Norma's murder, he was in California, but later retracted these statements. Rogers is a suspect in many other similar crimes throughout the country, but there is not enough evidence to bring charges. He was sentenced to death in Florida and California, and since 1997 he has been on death row in Florida, awaiting execution. However, the results of the DNA examination excluded Glenn from the list of suspects in the Port Hueneme murder case. Interestingly, after the death of the third victim, the bloody events in the city stopped. The situation changed radically only in 2000 with the emergence of innovative forensic technologies that made it possible to re-evaluate the old evidence. Law enforcement officers began to retrieve long-forgotten cases from the archives. By 2002, the analysis of the collected DNA samples did not yield any matches in the police database. But already in 2003, after repeated analyses, forensic experts managed to find a match. The DNA found under the nails of the deceased Norma belonged to 39-year-old Orn McKee, the same former colleague of the victim who was in love with her. Now all the facts fit into a single picture, despite the fact that the man managed to deceive the polygraph. This is usually only possible for real sociopaths who feel neither emotions nor remorse. Orn also lied about his plans for the evening after the murder and persuaded his friends to confirm a fictitious alibi. The investigators were impressed by how deftly McKee managed to deceive everyone. He seemed the least suspicious of all the persons involved in the case. But the evidence in the form of a DNA examination was indisputable. Samples of Orn were found on the ends of the tape found on Norma's face. On August 27, 2003, the killer was arrested. During interrogation, he was given a last chance to confess, but McKee continued to insist on his version of events. Soon he refused to cooperate with the investigation altogether and demanded a lawyer. The man was taken into custody and charged with murder. Preliminary hearings in the case took place on March 2, 2004. The prosecution was still hesitating whether to qualify this crime as first or second-degree murder. But already on January 10, 2005, Orn decided to make a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. However, he refused to give any explanations regarding the motives for his brutal act. According to McKee, on that fatal night he was under the influence of alcohol and so he could not remember the details of what happened. 41-year-old Orn McKee was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 15 years. Under the agreement, he was prohibited from filing appeals. Of course, having served the necessary minimum, he immediately began to petition for early release. But all his requests were rejected, including thanks to the active opposition from the relatives of the murdered Norma. As for the two other murders that shook the city, both criminals were found, and they had nothing to do with Norma's case. Orn McKee is still behind bars. He will have the next opportunity to be released early in August 2028. The victim's family has repeatedly stated that they will make every effort to prevent his release. Considering that the killer has been denied so far, most likely the same will happen next time. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.